Welcome to the sixth deep dive of our special summer series on diplomacy and international relations. It's really great to have you with us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, we've got a really fascinating topic lined up today.
We absolutely do. But, before we really jump into the thick of it, I just want to give a quick reminder to you, our listener, if you want to help keep these deep dives running, you can support the show via the Patreon link down in the description.
Right, and subscribing there actually gets you access to extra content, too, like our weekly and monthly political briefings.
Exactly. Especially those granular deep dive briefings on domestic Danish politics, which I know so many of you rely on. So definitely check that out.
It's a great resource, yeah.
Okay, so to kick things off today, I want you to imagine a scenario. Just, picture yourself stepping off a plane in a foreign country. It's a sensory experience we're all deeply familiar with.
Oh, yeah. You wake up, you're a little groggy, your ears are popping.
Yeah. Right. And you hear a completely different language crackling over the intercom. So you switch your phone off airplane mode to check whatever messages trickled in while you were, somewhere over the Atlantic.
Checking the text.
Yeah, and then you grab your carry-on, you follow those bilingual signs directing you to the exit, breeze through immigration, pick up your suitcase, and just head straight for that green lane.
Yeah.
The one labeled nothing to declare.
The best lane.
The best lane. And then a moment later, the sliding glass doors open, and you just walk out into a brand new city.
I mean, it's just an entirely routine sequence, right? Millions of individuals execute that exact choreography every single day.
Yeah, and we do it without giving it a second thought. It just feels entirely frictionless.
It does. But, the reality is that the sheer existence of that frictionless experience is a geopolitical miracle.
A miracle. That's a strong word.
Well, it is. Because we accept that seamlessness as an absolute given, like gravity. But if you stop and examine the actual mechanics of that routine, you realize you aren't just taking a walk through an airport terminal.
What are you walking through then?
You're walking through an invisible, incredibly complex, and honestly, heavily negotiated web of global coordination. It is the ultimate manifestation of international governance in action.
Okay, I want to really dig into the mechanics of this because this is where the source material gets so fascinating.
Yeah, let's break it down.
So, the plane you arrived on, it doesn't just chart a course based on where the pilot feels like flying today, right?
No, definitely not.
Its route, the safety protocols, even the exact language the air traffic controllers use to communicate with the cockpit, all of that is strictly regulated. It's governed by standards set by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO.
Exactly. And you mentioned your phone pinging a tower when you turn it on.
Yeah, getting those text messages.
Right. The moment your device powers up, it instantly negotiates with a foreign telecom network to get a signal. That interoperability, the fact that radio frequencies are shared so signals don't constantly jam each other, that's all managed by the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU.
Wow. And wait, what about that quick exit through customs, the nothing to declare lane?
That's facilitated by the harmonized system. It was established by the World Customs Organization, and it literally categorizes over 5,000 commodity groups so countries can actually process trade uniformly.
The layers of standardization are just staggering when you really look at it.
They are. I mean, you are moving through physical space, obviously, but you're primarily moving through overlapping jurisdictions of international law, technical standardization, and high-level diplomacy.
So if any of those organizations collapse tomorrow,
Oh, that simple walk through the airport would become a total bureaucratic nightmare. You'd be dealing with uncoordinated, conflicting national laws at every single step.
which brings us to the big question for today's deep dive. We are looking at an international system that is historically built on this premise of sovereign, independent states.
States that fiercely guard their independence, I might add.
Exactly. So the central question is, what exactly are international organizations? And why do sovereign states willingly bother to create them, fund them, and join them?
It really is the defining question of modern global politics. Because these organizations, ranging from massive heavyweights like the United Nations to highly specialized groups like the ITU, they aren't just bureaucratic acronyms sitting in an office in Geneva.
Right, they're much more than that.
They are the primary arenas where power, diplomacy, and global rules intersect. They often dictate the material reality of our daily lives way more than we realize.
Okay, so let's map out this global architecture. To really understand the global stage, our source material says we first have to look at the most exclusive clubs in the world.
The ones where the bouncers at the door have one absolute rule. They only let in states.
Right. No individuals, no multinational corporations, no charities, just states. We're talking about intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs.
Precisely. And the legal definition of an IGO requires a few very specific elements. First, it has to be founded upon a formal treaty.
Like a binding contract under international law.
Exactly. Second, it has to consist of more than two sovereign states. And third, crucially, it is entirely funded, governed, and voted upon by those specific member states.
So when we discuss IGOs, the premier example that instantly comes to everyone's mind is obviously the United Nations.
Of course.
But what stands out to me in the research isn't just the logistical work the UN does, it's what membership in the UN actually represents, legally speaking.
Yeah, it's profound.
Joining the UN isn't just a state saying, hey, we'd like a seat at the table to talk about climate change. It is the ultimate global validation of a country's sovereignty.
That is such a fundamental concept to grasp.
Yeah.
In the modern international system, membership essentially equals sovereignty.
Let's trace that back a bit. Where does this
Yeah.
idea of sovereignty come from?
Well, historically, the concept of state sovereignty is generally traced back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Ah, right, Westphalian sovereignty.
Exactly. That treaty essentially established the principle that states have the exclusive right to rule their own territories, without external overarching powers dictating their domestic affairs.
So nobody gets to tell a king how to run his kingdom.
Put simply, yes. And today, being admitted to the United Nations is the modern stamp of approval for that Westphalian sovereignty. It means the global community recognizes you as an equal peer. You have recognized borders, a functioning government, and the right of non-interference.
But the reality is that this stamp of approval isn't just an objective administrative checklist.
Oh, not at all.
It's not like passing a driving test where you meet the criteria and automatically get your license. It is a highly charged political process. And if we want to look at a stark example of how this operates, we have to look at the situation with Taiwan.
Taiwan provides a perfect, if incredibly complex, illustrative case. It shows exactly how membership, sovereignty, and raw political power get tangled up.
Because from a purely functional standpoint, Taiwan operates exactly like a sovereign state, right?
Completely. It has a permanent population of over 23 million people. It has a democratically elected government, a distinct constitution, its own military, and a highly advanced economy.
And yet, it is not a member of the United Nations.
It is not.
And they desperately want that membership. Because for Taiwan, getting that UN seat isn't just about diplomatic prestige, it is an existential shield.
Right. It would legally solidify their international recognition as a sovereign nation, which theoretically provides protection under international law.
Right.
But they are permanently blocked at the door.
Because of China.
Exactly. The People's Republic of China, which holds immense power within the UN, considers Taiwan to be a breakaway province, a part of its own sovereign territory.
So China just leverages its massive diplomatic and economic influence to keep them out.
Relentlessly. They continuously block Taiwan's requests for participation, not just in the UN General Assembly, but even in specialized agencies like the World Health Organization.
Which is wild when you think about it during a global health crisis.
It really is. But it's a stark demonstration that IGOs are not perfectly neutral, technocratic arbiters of global rules. They are fiercely political arenas where the most powerful states can and do exert their will to define reality for everyone else.
Okay, so to understand exactly how a state like China can exert that kind of leverage, we need to open the hood of the United Nations and look at the engine. Because the UN is not a flat egalitarian structure.
Definitely not. It's composed of different organs that operate on entirely different mechanical principles.
Right. So on one side, you have the General Assembly, which is essentially the democratic heart of the organization.
Yes. The General Assembly is where every single member state, all 193 of them, gets exactly one vote.
So parity is the rule there.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if you are the United States with a massive economy, or a tiny island nation like Tuvalu, or a smaller Nordic state like Denmark. In the General Assembly, everyone has an equal say. This is the forum where you see world leaders deliver their annual addresses behind that famous dark green marble podium.
Right. But, and this is a massive But while the General Assembly is incredibly democratic in its representation, it fundamentally lacks teeth.
It does.
It can pass resolutions, it can set global agendas, it can condemn actions, but its resolutions are generally non-binding. It cannot legally force a state to do anything.
Which is a huge limitation.
Okay.
If you want actual enforceable power, you have to leave the General Assembly and enter the exclusive VIP room,
The Security Council.
the Security Council.
Right.
This is where the hard power of the international system resides. It consists of only 15 members. 10 of those are non-permanent, elected for 2-year terms to ensure some geographic rotation.
Denmark occasionally gets a seat there. Right.
Yes, Denmark has served on the Security Council several times. It's a huge diplomatic priority for smaller states to get that temporary seat. But the structural core of the council, the actual center of gravity, lies with the permanent 5, or the P5.
China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
The primary victors of the Second World War, cementing their geopolitical dominance right into the architecture of the post-war world.
And under the UN Charter, the Security Council is the only organ that possesses the legal authority to impose binding decisions on all member states.
That's right. It can level devastating economic sanctions, it can authorize the use of military force, and it can deploy UN peacekeepers, those famous blue helmets.
But the mechanics of how it makes those decisions is what defines the limits of international law, because any single member of the P5 holds absolute veto power.
The veto is everything. If 14 out of the 15 members vote to authorize a peacekeeping mission, but one of the P5 members casts a veto, the resolution dies instantly.
Which naturally leads to a massive structural problem. I look at this mechanism and have to ask, isn't the UN inherently paralyzed by design?
That's the billion-dollar question.
I mean, if the Secretary General only has the power of moral persuasion, and the Security Council can be deadlocked by a single veto from a superpower protecting its own interests, the whole system stalls the moment powerful states disagree.
It is paralyzed by design, yes. And that is perhaps the most tragic reality of intergovernmentalism. It is vital to draw a clear distinction here. IGOs provide global governance, but they are absolutely not a global government.
They don't rule the world.
No, the United Nations does not sit above its member states. It is a creature created by them. If the powerful states disagree, the machinery just grinds to a halt. The source material highlights the Syrian civil war, which erupted in 2011, as a harrowing case study of this exact mechanical failure.
Right. We are talking about a conflict where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, cities reduced to rubble, and millions forced into refugee status. From a humanitarian perspective, it's the exact type of crisis the UN was theoretically built to stop.
Yet, the UN could not mount a coordinated, decisive intervention. Why? Because the permanent members of the Security Council had deeply competing geopolitical interests.
Russia and China.
Yes, Russia and China repeatedly used their veto power to block resolutions that would have condemned the Syrian government, imposed targeted sanctions, or even authorized robust cross-border aid mechanisms without the Syrian government's consent.
And they argued that based on Westphalian principles, right?
Exactly. They argued that such interventions violated Syria's state sovereignty. The UN could not force an intervention because its entire legal architecture is ultimately subservient to the sovereignty and the veto power of its most powerful members.
It is a sobering realization. We read the UN Charter, which opens with this soaring ambition to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But the fine print reveals that the institution is purposefully designed to respect the sovereignty of powerful states above almost all other moral considerations.
It's a harsh reality.
Which naturally raises a huge question. If the UN, the pinnacle of global diplomacy, cannot actually force a sovereign state to act against its will, does any international organization have that kind of supreme authority?
That question brings us to a fascinating anomaly in the international system. There is an exception, and it is the European Union.
Okay, the EU. How does the European Union break the fundamental rules of state sovereignty we just outlined?
Well, as we established, almost all IGOs from the UN to the World Health Organization are strictly intergovernmental. Power remains firmly anchored at the state level. But the European Union operates differently. Political scientists refer to it as sui generis.
Which means of its own kind in Latin.
Exactly. It's unique because it is one of the only organizations on the planet that possesses true supranational authority.
Supranational, literally meaning above the nation. I want to clarify the mechanics of how that actually works in practice, because it sounds a bit abstract. It's not just that European leaders meet and agree on things. The EU actually has the legal architecture to override the parliaments of its member states.
It does. Through decades of treaties, the member states of the EU have actively and voluntarily agreed to pool portions of their sovereignty. They relocate that decision-making power to a supranational level, specifically to institutions like the European Commission and the European Parliament.
But the real mechanism of this power lies in the courts, right?
Yes, in jurisprudence. There's a foundational legal principle called the supremacy of EU law. If a national law of a member state, say France or Germany, directly conflicts with a piece of European Union legislation, the EU law takes precedence.
Wow.
The national courts are legally obligated to enforce the EU law over their own domestic statutes.
That is a staggering departure from the Westphalian system. A French judge enforcing a law drafted in Brussels over a law passed in Paris.
Exactly. And it's not just legal supremacy, it's economic too. Look at the Eurozone. You have 20 countries that have entirely abandoned their historical national currencies, the franc, the mark, the lira, to share a single currency managed by the European Central Bank.
And controlling the money supply and setting interest rates are historically the defining privileges of a sovereign state. Relinquishing that to a supranational body is a massive transfer of power.
It's an incredible historical experiment. Consider the context. For centuries, European history was defined by absolute sovereigns brutally fighting each other for territorial dominance.
Right, nonstop wars.
And then, in the aftermath of the absolute devastation of World War II, they consciously decided to intertwine their economies and legal systems so deeply that going to war with one another would become logistically and economically impossible.
But an experiment of that magnitude is bound to generate intense friction. I mean, when an international organization holds actual, enforceable supranational power over daily life, dictating everything from trade tariffs to environmental regulations to labor rights, it eventually rubs raw against domestic politics.
Inevitably, because as the supranational body grows in power, citizens and domestic politicians begin to feel an acute democratic deficit. The perception grows that crucial decisions affecting their daily lives are no longer being made by the politicians they directly elect to their national parliaments, but by distant, unelected bureaucrats sitting in Brussels.
Which brings us directly to Brexit.
Exactly.
The British public voting in 2016 to leave the European Union wasn't just a dispute over trade quotas, it was the ultimate concrete manifestation of this exact friction. The driving slogan of the Leave campaign was literally, "Take back control."
It was an explicit domestic desire to reclaim absolute state sovereignty from a supranational body.
Yeah, and we've seen other states navigate this friction differently, too. Denmark is a fascinating example here. They are in the EU, but they've negotiated several strict opt-outs to protect their sovereignty.
Yes. The Danish opt-outs are a perfect example. After initially rejecting the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum, Denmark negotiated exemptions in specific areas, like justice and home affairs, and crucially, they opted out of adopting the euro. They kept the Danish krone.
So they get the benefits of the single market, but put a hard boundary on how much monetary sovereignty they give up.
Precisely. It highlights the sheer volatility of asking populations to balance the economic benefits of deep international cooperation against the psychological and political need for national independence. Brexit is just the most extreme case study of the limits of supranationalism.
And it perfectly illustrates why the EU remains such an anomaly on the global stage. Because when you look at other regional or issue-based IGOs around the world, you realize they have observed the European experiment and deliberately chosen to avoid the supranational path.
They want the economic and diplomatic benefits of cooperation, but they refuse to surrender their legal supremacy. Let's look at how other regions handle this balance. They have their own acronyms, but entirely different mechanics under the hood.
Take Asia, for example.
Right, you have ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN fosters deep economic integration and political dialogue, but it operates strictly on what is known as the ASEAN Way.
What's that?
It's a fundamental principle of consensus and absolute non-interference in the domestic affairs of its members. There is no supranational court in ASEAN that can strike down a law passed in Indonesia or Thailand.
Makes sense. And in Africa.
Similarly, the African Union promotes continental integration and security cooperation, but it does not possess a supranational parliament with the authority to override the constitutions of its member states.
And we also see global configurations that aren't based on geography at all, but rather historical ties or pure economic gravity. Look at the Commonwealth. It's a massive organization restricted primarily to former territories of the British Empire, operating with a permanent secretariat to promote democratic values, but strictly on an intergovernmental basis.
Or, more recently, BRICS.
Ah, BRICS is a fascinating structural counterpoint.
It is. BRICS, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and recently expanding, represents a powerful bloc of major emerging economies seeking to challenge traditional Western economic dominance.
But structurally, it operates entirely without a fixed permanent secretariat or a centralized bureaucracy, right?
Exactly. It functions through annual summits and rotating presidencies. It is purely intergovernmental coordination at the highest levels. They deliberately avoid the creation of an independent bureaucracy that could develop its own autonomous power.
Beyond regional and economic blocs, the international system is absolutely blanketed by issue-specific IGOs. We touched on the ITU and aviation earlier, but there are hundreds.
Thousands, really.
Like the International Whaling Commission, managing the conservation of whale stocks, or Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, which, by the way, doesn't actually have its own global police force with badges and guns.
Right, it acts as a massive encrypted communications network to coordinate law enforcement across borders.
And then you have highly sensitive organizations like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency.
The IAEA is an excellent example of how these various webs interconnect and rely on one another. It's a highly specialized IGO filled with nuclear physicists and engineers. Its mandate is to monitor nuclear facilities globally to ensure that nuclear material is not being diverted from peaceful energy programs into weapons programs.
But the IAEA itself doesn't have a military wing, right? It can't bomb a rogue reactor.
No, it cannot. The mechanics of its founding statute dictate that its inspection reports go directly to the United Nations Security Council. So, the IAEA provides the technical monitoring and the verification, but it must rely entirely on the UN Security Council to actually enforce measures like sanctions or military strikes against states that violate their non-proliferation obligations.
Which brings us right back to the structural bottleneck we discussed earlier. The web is highly integrated, deeply technical, and constantly monitoring the globe, but the ultimate enforcement muscle still rests with the sovereign states at the very top of the UN structure.
Exactly.
But here's where the story shifts. Because up to this point, we have been talking exclusively about states. But states are no longer the only entities wielding significant influence on the global stage. What happens when ordinary citizens, civil society groups, or private coalitions decide they aren't going to wait for governments to act?
This is where we step beyond the traditional Westphalian framework and examine the explosive growth of NGOs.
International non-governmental organizations.
Right. If IGOs are the exclusive, state-only country clubs, IGOs are the diverse, sprawling vehicles of global civil society. The formal definition of an IGO is essentially defined by what it is not.
Okay, so what aren't they?
They are organizations operating across international borders that are not established by intergovernmental treaties. They are not for-profit multinational corporations, and they are not violent terrorist networks. They are driven by civil society to pursue a specific social, political, or humanitarian objective.
And their presence in the international system has grown exponentially over the last few decades, right? They aren't just fringe actors anymore.
Hardly. They are deeply embedded in global governance. The United Nations Economic and Social Council currently lists over 4,000 NGOs that hold official consultative status.
Meaning what exactly?
It means they have the right to attend UN meetings, submit written statements, and actively lobby state delegates. And that 4,000 is just a fraction of the tens of thousands of NGOs operating globally without formal UN ties.
Let's break down how NGOs actually exert power. Because lacking armies or the ability to pass binding laws, their mechanics of influence are entirely different from states. They employ vastly different tactics.
They do.
When I first think of NGOs, my mind immediately jumps to the loud ones, the groups that utilize spectacle to command the news cycle. You picture activists from Greenpeace in tiny inflatable Zodiac boats, physically placing themselves between massive whaling ships and their prey, or scaling deep-sea oil rigs to drop massive banners.
Yes, the classic direct action tactics.
Or you think of anti-globalization protesters forming human chains to block the streets of Seattle or Genoa during major World Trade Organization summits. They are leveraging disruption and media spectacle to force neglected issues onto the global agenda.
That represents the activist advocacy wing of civil society. Their primary mechanisms are naming, shaming, and agenda setting. They generate public outrage, which in turn pressures domestic politicians, who then alter their states' positions at international negotiations. It is an indirect but highly potent form of power.
But that's just one side of the coin.
Exactly. There is an equally vital, entirely different tactic employed by a massive subset of NGOs: the quiet operational responders.
The ones doing the heavy lifting on the ground.
Right. These are the organizations focused entirely on providing direct lifelines, often in environments where sovereign states have collapsed or are actively harming their own citizens.
You're talking about groups like Doctors Without Borders.
Yes, Médecins Sans Frontières is a prime example. They don't focus on lobbying in Geneva. Their mechanism of action is deploying highly skilled medical professionals directly into conflict zones, refugee camps, and areas hit by epidemics. They operate on principles of strict neutrality and impartiality, negotiating access with state armies and rebel warlords alike.
And you see similar work from Nordic groups too, right? Like the Danish Refugee Council. They do incredible operational work in conflict zones worldwide, dealing directly with displacement and shelter.
Absolutely. The Danish Refugee Council is a massive operational INGO. You also have massive groups like Mercy Corps, which rebuilds infrastructure after earthquakes, or Oxfam, which implements complex agricultural and water programs to combat systemic poverty. They aren't chaining themselves to ships. They are delivering immediate material reality where the state apparatus has failed.
It reminds me of a quote from former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who had a profound respect for civil society. He called these NGOs the unsung heroes of the international community.
It's a very apt description.
Because while diplomats debate comma placements in treaties and air-conditioned rooms, these NGOs are executing the granular, grueling, and highly dangerous work of global governance in the mud and the rubble.
And what's truly fascinating in the modern era is how the traditional boundaries between the sovereign state and the independent civil society are beginning to blur. We are witnessing the rise of a new structural model, the hybrid organization.
A hybrid. Let's unpack the mechanics of that. How do you mix the rigid legal structure of a sovereign government with the fluid, independent nature of a charity or an NGO?
It sounds contradictory, but it is proving highly effective. A premier example detailed in the research is the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature.
Okay, how does that work?
If you look at its voting membership, it is a deliberate hybrid. It includes official government agencies like the environmental ministries of sovereign states such as Spain or Fiji, sitting directly alongside completely independent environmental NGOs, indigenous peoples organizations, and individual scientific experts. They all gather in the same assembly and vote on conservation policies together.
But why design it that way? Why not keep the state diplomats in one building and the environmental activists in another and let them lobby each other traditionally?
Because the traditional model is too slow to address modern borderless crises like biodiversity loss. The hybrid model creates a deeply pragmatic synergy. Think about the respective strengths and weaknesses here.
Okay, states have the money and the power.
Right. Sovereign states possess massive funding capabilities, legal authority, and the power to actually enforce regulations. But bureaucracies are notoriously slow, risk-averse, and often lack specialized, cutting-edge scientific knowledge.
And the NGOs have the science but no power.
Exactly. NGOs possess incredible specialized expertise, agility, grassroots connections, and passion. But they usually lack the legal authority to enact laws and the budget to scale their solutions globally.
Ah, I see. So the mechanism is synthesis. You bind them together in a single organization, and you suddenly have a highly effective tool. The NGOs provide the rapid scientific data and push the ambition, and the state members provide the funding and the regulatory muscle to actually implement the policies. It is an evolutionary step in international governance.
Precisely. It is an acknowledgement that states alone cannot solve planetary problems, but civil society cannot do it without state power either.
All right, we have spent a lot of time mapping this architecture. We have the states fiercely guarding their sovereignty. We have the EU experimenting with supranationalism. We have the UN deadlocked by vetoes, and we have the NGOs lobbying and operating on the ground. It is an incredibly intricate system.
It really is.
But I want to introduce some friction here and really get to this so what factor. Because we can talk about treaties and acronyms all day, but does any of this actually matter in the grand sweep of history? Do these organizations actually fundamentally alter the way the world works, or are they just a massive, expensive bureaucracy that essentially acts as a talking shop for things states were going to do anyway?
That is the ultimate test of their relevance. And if we look critically at the historical record, we can identify major, undeniable milestones where international organizations didn't just participate in world events, they fundamentally rewrote the rules of human behavior.
Let's look at 3 major historical shifts from the source material to prove this point. The first takes us all the way back to the mid-19th century, specifically to 1859.
Over a century and a half ago.
Set the scene for us. What is the mechanism of change here?
The mechanism here is individual moral outrage, sparking institutional creation. A Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant was traveling through northern Italy on a business trip. He unexpectedly stumbled upon the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Solferino.
That was a massive clash between French and Austrian empires, right?
Yes, and it was a scene of unimaginable horror. Nearly 40,000 soldiers were left dead, dying, or horribly wounded on the battlefield, with virtually no organized medical care from either army.
The sovereign states involved had mobilized massive armies to slaughter each other, but just hadn't bothered to build the logistics to care for the survivors.
Exactly. The states failed completely.
Yeah.
Dunant was so traumatized and horrified by the sheer scale of the unaddressed human suffering that he completely abandoned his business trip. He managed to organize the local civilian population, mainly women from nearby villages, to provide basic assistance, water, and bandages to the wounded.
And he didn't care which uniform they were wearing.
Right. He explicitly instructed them to help soldiers from both sides indiscriminately.
Just a private citizen stepping into the void because the state apparatus had failed.
But he didn't stop there. That experience haunted him. He returned to Geneva, wrote a powerful, visceral book about the horrors he witnessed, and began aggressively lobbying political leaders across Europe. His relentless personal campaign led directly to the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, in 1863.
Which is arguably one of the most respected and recognized organizations in the world today. But, creating an NGO isn't the same as changing history. What was the actual legal outcome?
The legal outcome was revolutionary. Dunant and the early ICRC recognized that a charity wasn't enough. They needed to fundamentally change the laws of war. They convened a diplomatic conference in 1864, which resulted in the adoption of the First Geneva Convention.
What?
This treaty legally mandated that military hospitals be recognized as neutral zones and that wounded soldiers must be cared for regardless of nationality. Think about the magnitude of that mechanism. An Ingo, sparked by the distress of a single civilian, literally drove sovereign states to draft and sign the foundational documents of international humanitarian law. They changed the legal expectations of how sovereign states are permitted to conduct armed conflict.
That is an unbelievable legacy. It traces a direct line from a bloody, muddy field in Italy straight to the bedrock of modern international law. Okay, so that establishes humanitarian rules. What is the second milestone?
The second milestone deals with the concept of accountability, and it fundamentally challenges the core of Westphalian sovereignty we discussed earlier. For centuries, under the strict interpretation of that 1648 treaty, state leaders operated with almost total impunity within their own borders.
A monarch, a president, or a dictator was the ultimate, unquestionable legal authority.
Right. If they decided to oppress, imprison, or massacre their own domestic populations, there was no higher global authority with the legal right to hold them criminally responsible.
They were the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and international law essentially said, hey, that's an internal matter.
Exactly. But over the last few decades, that paradigm of absolute impunity has been deeply eroded. And a major catalyst for that erosion was the creation of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, established by the Rome Statute and headquartered in The Hague.
Let me push back here, though. The idea of an international court isn't entirely new. After the Nuremberg trials post-World War II, the UN had been talking about setting up a permanent international criminal court since the early 1950s, but it sat completely dormant for decades. Why did it suddenly burst into reality in the late 1990s? States didn't just wake up and decide to limit their own power, did they?
No, states rarely surrender power willingly. It happened because of the coordinated mechanics of global civil society. The stalemate was broken in the 1990s by the relentless, highly organized efforts of a massive coalition of over 2,500 NGOs operating under the umbrella of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court.
So it wasn't just protesting in the streets.
No, this was sophisticated legal and diplomatic warfare. These NGOs drafted legal briefs. They relentlessly lobbied middle power governments, including significant support from smaller European and Nordic states like Denmark, and they publicly shamed major powers that tried to water down the treaty.
Man, it worked.
It did. Their coordinated pressure culminated in the 1997 Rome Conference, forcing states to establish a world court with actual teeth.
And the mechanism of the ICC is fascinating because of a concept called complementarity, right? It doesn't replace national courts, but it acts as a backstop.
Correct.
If a state is genuinely unwilling or unable to prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide committed by its own leaders, the ICC has the jurisdiction to step in.
Exactly. It established a permanent legal jurisdiction where individuals, even sitting heads of state, can be indicted and prosecuted. We have seen arrest warrants issued for presidents and warlords. The era of total, impenetrable sovereign impunity has been legally breached, and it was civil society that provided the overwhelming force to push that rock up the hill.
But let me play devil's advocate on the ICC's actual effectiveness. It is a brilliant legal architecture, but three of the most powerful countries on Earth, the United States, China, and Russia, are not members of the Rome Statute.
That's true.
They refuse to subject their citizens to its jurisdiction. So, while NGOs achieved a massive legal victory, hasn't the mechanism of geopolitical hegemony severely limited the court's actual reach?
That is the central, unavoidable critique of the ICC, and you are entirely correct. The court is a triumph of legal architecture, but it is heavily constrained by the realities of power politics. When the major superpowers refuse to participate, the court's jurisdiction is disproportionately focused on smaller states or regions where those superpowers don't actively block investigations.
It highlights the constant friction we keep returning to. The noble aspirations of international law constantly slamming into the hard wall of state sovereignty.
Precisely.
Okay, so we have the rules of war established in Geneva and international criminal justice established in The Hague. What is the third major milestone where IOs altered history?
The third milestone involves a paradigm shift regarding our collective responsibility for the physical planet itself. For this, we look to the 1992 UN Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro.
The environment. This is an area where international coordination is literally a matter of species survival, because a carbon molecule emitted in one country doesn't respect a Westphalian border.
Precisely. But historically, environmental degradation, polluting a river, or chopping down a forest was viewed strictly as a local or national economic issue. A state had the sovereign right to exploit its own natural resources however it saw fit.
But Rio changed that.
It changed the legal and diplomatic baseline. It was a massive convergence, where the sheer convening power of the United Nations met the intense, coordinated lobbying of thousands of environmental NGOs.
What were the actual mechanics of what came out of Rio? What changed on paper?
The summit forced sovereign states to formally acknowledge, via international law, that the environment is a global commons. The most critical mechanism created was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC.
Oh, that's the treaty that led to everything else.
Yes, it established the foundational legal architecture that eventually led to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. It also birthed the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Though enforcing these agreements remains incredibly difficult, right?
Very difficult. But Rio fundamentally altered the normative baseline. It established the legal premise that states have a collective binding responsibility to protect the Earth's climate and biodiversity, permanently altering global industrial and diplomatic strategies.
Those are three massive, undeniably historical impacts. We have mapped how IOs can create incredible good, but I want to shift the lens and address a very prominent critique in the source material.
Okay, let's hear it.
We hear a lot about these grand, soaring treaties signed in Geneva or Rio or tribunals in The Hague. But when we look at organizations focused on economics and poverty, specifically the Bretton Woods institutions, do organizations like the UN and the World Bank actually change the material reality for people living in poverty? Or, as some economists and structuralist thinkers argue, do their mechanisms sometimes actually make things worse?
That is a highly valid critique, and the reality drawn from the extensive research presents a deeply complex, often contentious picture. It is certainly not a simple story of unqualified success.
Let's start with the positives.
If we look at certain arms of the UN, like the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, or UNICEF, they have been absolute lifelines. The mechanisms they employ, vaccination drives, funding local agricultural improvements, building schools, have tangibly helped to lift millions out of absolute poverty, drastically reduced infant mortality, and worked to close gender education gaps in regions where that gap was historically immense.
But there is a significant but here, particularly when we move from the UN's grant-based aid to the massive international financial institution.
A very significant but. When you examine the mechanisms of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the results are fiercely debated by economists and developing nations alike. These institutions provide the massive capital loans that developing states desperately need to build infrastructure or stabilize their economies during a crisis.
But the core mechanism of these loans is that the money rarely, if ever, comes without strict conditions attached, right?
Exactly. We were talking about structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
Explain the mechanics of these conditionalities. How does a loan from the IMF alter the domestic politics of a sovereign state?
This is where global governance directly dictates local reality. When the IMF bails out a struggling economy, it typically enforces a set of economic policies, often referred to as the Washington Consensus. The conditionalities require the borrowing state to rapidly deregulate its economy.
What does that look like on the ground?
This often involves forced privatization of state-owned public services like water or electricity utilities, slashing government spending on social safety nets like health and education, cutting food subsidies, and devaluing their national currency to boost exports.
The argument from the IMF being that this short-term pain will enforce fiscal discipline and lead to long-term macroeconomic stability. But the critique is that the mechanism fundamentally ignores the human cost.
Exactly. Critics, including Nobel laureate economists and leaders of the Global South, point out that these top-down, one-size-fits-all assistance programs are often drafted by economists in Washington, D.C., who are disconnected from the local realities.
Right, they aren't the ones losing their food subsidies.
No. And in many historical cases, forcing a developing nation to instantly cut food subsidies or charge for public health clinics has led to immediate spikes in extreme poverty and social unrest.
Furthermore, it creates a cycle. Sometimes these policies fail to generate the promised economic growth, leaving the developing nation burdened with crippling debt, forced to take out another loan, and subject to even more conditionalities. It effectively hollows out their sovereignty as their national budgets are now being dictated by an IGO.
And that is the crux of the debate. Do these international financial institutions lift nations out of poverty? Or do their specific structural mechanisms inadvertently reinforce a neo-colonial cycle of dependency and debt? The impact of IOs on global economics is profound and undeniable, but it is not uniformly positive. It is a space of intense, ongoing friction.
You know, since we were talking so much about the internal mechanics of these places and how decisions are made, let's actually try something a little different for a few minutes.
Okay, what are you thinking?
Let's do a quick simulated interview, like a role play segment.
Oh boy, all right, I'm game.
No, it'll be great. I want you to put on the hat of a high-level practitioner, let's say a seasoned diplomat or a senior official representing a smaller member state, like Denmark, at the UN or the EU. And I'll ask you a few questions from that perspective.
Okay, I could do that. I've got my Danish diplomat hat on. Fire away.
All right, Mr. Diplomat. From an insider's view, how are the really crucial decisions actually made in these international organizations? Because we read about the formal voting in the General Assembly, but is that where the real action happens?
Well, officially, yes, the vote is what matters. But realistically, the real decisions are made in the corridors, the coffee shops, and the bilateral backrooms long before the gavel ever drops in the main hall. By the time a resolution hits the floor, we already know the exact vote count. The text has been watered down, amended, and negotiated in dozens of smaller, informal working groups. It's an exhausting process of constant granular compromise.
Interesting. So as a representative of a smaller member state like Denmark, what are the biggest constraints you face in those backrooms compared to, say, the US or China?
Our biggest constraint is simply institutional capacity and leverage. A major power has a massive delegation. They have experts on every single subcommittee. They can offer economic or military incentives or threats to secure votes. As a small state, we don't have that kind of hard power leverage. We can't threaten to withhold billions in aid if a country votes against us.
So how do you actually get things done then? What are the opportunities for a state like Denmark to punch above its weight?
It's all about soft power, niche expertise, and coalition building. We can't bully our way to a resolution, so we have to lead by example and build alliances. Denmark, for instance, focuses heavily on being a normative superpower in areas like human rights, green energy transition, and international law. We provide highly specialized technical expertise to the committees. We partner with civil society and NGOs to amplify our voice. We act as honest brokers, bridging gaps between larger, more polarized nations. If you are seen as a neutral, reliable, and highly competent partner, even a small state can heavily influence the drafting of international rules.
That is fascinating. Okay, you can take the diplomat hat off now.
Phew, glad that's over.
You did great. But it really grounds the theory we've been discussing. We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We have mapped everything from the mechanical standardization of international airports to the veto power of the UN Security Council.
We covered a lot, yeah.
We've examined the supranational anomaly of the European Union, the on-the-ground reality of NGOs like MSF, and traced history from the battlefields of 1859 to the debt crises of the modern era. If you, the listener, are trying to synthesize this massive web of acronyms and history, what are the core lessons?
Let's distill this deep dive into three critical takeaways about how our world actually operates.
I believe the first critical takeaway is recognizing exactly why international organizations exist in the first place and why they have multiplied so rapidly over the last century.
Going back to our airport analogy, exactly. IOs are the essential hidden architecture required to manage a deeply interconnected world. Whether it is managing the electromagnetic spectrum for mobile networks, coordinating the response to global health pandemics, or regulating the corridors of international aviation, modern states, no matter how powerful, simply cannot manage the sheer mechanical complexities of modern life alone. IOs are the necessary functional response to the reality of globalization.
Okay, insight number two focuses on the mechanics of power, how IOs actually shape politics. We have seen that they aren't just paper tigers or bureaucratic talking shops, they act as a real, tangible check on absolute state power.
They do.
Through the relentless, coordinated pressure of civil society NGOs and the establishment of legal bodies like the International Criminal Court, the centuries-long era of total, unquestioned Westphalian state impunity is slowly but surely eroding. State leaders now have to constantly calculate the legal and diplomatic consequences of their actions under international law.
And the third insight is highly practical for our listeners. What should you watch for when you read the news? Going forward, pay close attention to the constant, grinding friction between the desire for state sovereignty and the necessity of global governance. That tension is the fundamental fault line of all modern international relations.
You see it everywhere once you know to look for it. Whenever you read a headline about the UN Security Council failing to authorize aid because of a superpower veto.
Or whenever you see a domestic political movement demanding that a nation withdraw from a supranational body like the EU, or reject a ruling from an international court.
You are witnessing that exact inherent tension playing out in real time. The ongoing daily struggle between a sovereign state's immediate national interest and its long-term international obligations is the defining dynamic of global politics today. It is the perpetual push and pull that shapes the borders, the laws, and the reality of our world.
Before we officially wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on the history we unpacked today.
Really on us.
Think back to the story of Henry Dunant, a single businessman armed with nothing but moral revulsion after witnessing the horrific aftermath of a battle in 1859, managed to spark a civil society movement that eventually forced empires to forge the Geneva Conventions and write the laws of war.
It is an incredible historical testament to the latent power of the individual witness. It proves that the architecture of global law isn't just written by diplomats. It is often forged by everyday outrage.
So the question to consider today is this. In our modern hyper-connected era, where every citizen has a high-definition camera in their pocket and the ability to instantly broadcast to millions, what modern tragedies, environmental disasters, or human rights abuses are currently being witnessed by everyday people right now? And which of those specific localized tragedies will generate the coordinated civil society pressure necessary to become the catalyst that forces states to write the international laws of tomorrow?
Wow. That is an incredibly powerful lens to look through the next time you are scrolling through your feed and seeing raw footage from conflict zones or environmental crises around the world. The rigid bureaucratic rules of tomorrow's international system are almost certainly being written by the raw outrage of today's citizens.
Absolutely.
This has been an incredibly extensive deep dive into the hidden architecture of our geopolitical world, but this is really just setting the stage. In our next deep dive in this summer series, we are going to explore this exact concept of the public voice even further. We will be looking at the mechanics of global civil society in much greater detail, examining exactly how the voices of everyday people, decentralized networks, and massive Iningo coalitions are organizing to fundamentally challenge the entrenched power of the sovereign state.
It's going to be a fascinating, entirely necessary continuation of the mechanisms we just discussed today.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for joining us on this intellectual journey through the global system. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please follow the show on your podcast app and leave us a 5-star rating. It genuinely is the best possible way to help these deep dives reach more people who are insanely curious about the actual mechanics of how the world works. And remember, check out the Patreon link in the description to support the show directly and gain access to our weekly and monthly briefings, including that fascinating, granular look at Danish domestic politics we mentioned earlier. So the next time you step off a plane, grab your suitcase and stroll effortlessly through that nothing to declare lane. Take a moment to look around at the signs, the phones, and the passports. You aren't just walking through an airport, you are walking right through the middle of a masterpiece of invisible, high-stakes global diplomacy. Until next time, keep diving deep.